So let us now welcome Ethan Milne, who will be presenting a presentation by himself, as well as a couple other co-authors, Kirk Kristofferson and Miranda Goode.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me out. My name's Ethan, and I'm a current fifth year PhD student at the Ivey Business School in Western University in Canada. And I'm really excited to be presenting this work with my two co-authors and also advisors, Kirk Kristofferson and Miranda Goode. So one thing I'll say before I get into this presentation is that I've been seeing a lot of the talks here. This is my first time coming to the Harry Potter Academic Conference, and it's been really interesting to see because as you'll soon learn, I'm a marketing scholar. And so I work in a business school, and most of the research that we do is intended to benefit brands and managers in some way. And so I think the area of focus that we take in our research tends to be a little bit different than many of the talks that I've seen. So it's been really nice to get exposure to that side of fan studies. So without further ado, I'm really excited to present my work about fan fiction and how it relates to copyright on the part of brands. So usually when I give this talk, it's often to other professors in business schools, and I have to explain what fan fiction is. So I'm really excited that I don't have to do that in this case. But fan fiction, just as a stipulated definition, it's when fans take existing media and repackage it or extend it or transform it in some way in their own words, using their own spins on existing media properties. So they might take things like existing plots, characters, settings, and other things and make it their own in some way. And fan fiction is a really big area. Brands that care about fan fiction, they certainly care about fan fiction a lot. If you look at just the Harry Potter fandom alone, I mean, the Harry Potter fandom has hundreds of thousands of fan fictions published every single year. This is some data taken from a large-scale scraping of the fanfiction.net website. And as of at least 2015 or so, there were at least 700 or so thousand fan fictions published in the Harry Potter fandom. And this represents billions and billions of words written all about Harry Potter. And if you're a brand, well, you care a lot about what consumers are writing about your brand and how they're engaging with your media properties. But a thing that comes up and really is, which is the focus of my work, is how brands handle fan fiction with respect to their copyright. So when brands think about fan fiction, there's a few things that they're concerned about. The first being that fan fiction might plausibly be copyright violating, at least in some instances. If you think about how fan fiction works, fan fiction authors are often taking elements of original media, they're distributing it publicly, and sometimes they're also making money off their work. So they might have things like a Patreon, or they might be, wholesale copying entire chapters or snippets of entire original media works. And so brands are worried that fan fiction authors are taking in elements of their original media, repackaging it as their own, and selling it off for a profit. Now, this varies in terms of extent, and in fact, there's very strong arguments that many fan fiction authors engage in what we would call transformative use of original media properties. But this doesn't mean that all fan fiction authors do this. And frankly, the extent to which they are correct on a legal analysis doesn't always matter so much when it comes to the practical realities of how fan fiction authors navigate their relationships with brands. It might be the case that fan fiction is not copyright violating, but if brands treat it as such and they engage in lawsuits over copyright, and fan fiction authors who don't have a lot of resources have to back off on creating their original works because they're scared of that copyright threat, then in effect it might end up being sort of copyright violating, even if it doesn't necessarily follow the letter of the law. And so when brands are thinking about fan fiction, when they think that it might be copyright violating, there's a few things that brands are often worried about. They're worried about things like substitution and dilution effects resulting from copyright violation. With respect to substitution effects, brands are really worried that if consumers engage with copyright violating products, they're not going to want to purchase the original media product to begin with. And a really classic case of that in the marketing literature is the case of Louis Vuitton bags. Louis Vuitton is really concerned about fans purchasing knockoff Louis Vuitton bags, which copy the overall aesthetics and make of a Louis Vuitton bag, because if a fan goes out and buys the fake one, they're not going to go and buy the real one. So with respect to fan fiction, brands might be worried that fan fiction acts as a substitute for the original media product. Another concern is dilution. If a brand is looking at a potentially copyright violating product and fans are consuming that, a worry the brand might have is that the fan will consume the fake version or the not real version. And if the not real version is bad, then the consumer might form negative associations with the original brand, even though the original brand had nothing to do with the experience that the consumer had. So brands are concerned about these substitution and dilution effects, but what I argue for over the course of the paper is that brands are mistaken to think that these substitution and dilution effects are at play with respect to fan fiction, which means that some of the motivations that brands have for engaging in copyright violation lawsuits against fan fiction authors and fan fiction platforms might be misguided. So over the course of the paper, there's a few research questions that we address. The first being that, does fan fiction actually harm brands via these substitution or dilution effects? I'm going to argue that they don't, and I'll give you a few reasons to believe that. The next is, what are some other benefits that fan fiction can actually have for brands? Maybe fan fiction doesn't have these substitution and dilution effects, and there's actually other uses that brands can find for encouraging fan fiction. And the final question is, if it is the case that fan fiction lacks some of the harms we traditionally associate with copyright violation, and it has some other benefits that brands might benefit from, brands might want to encourage more fan fiction and get more of it so they can have a larger pool of consumers creating content about their brands. And so if that's the case, maybe there's some strategies that brands can employ to motivate further fan fiction production. So over the course of this paper, we have 7 studies in our main manuscript and several more in a supplementary web appendix, but I'm only going to go over 3 or so of them today. I'm going to talk about some experimental work that I've done demonstrating that fan fiction lacks substitution and dilution effects. I'm going to go over one of the benefits that fan fiction can have for brands in that it can help them predict the performance of their media products. And I'm also going to look at one strategy that brands can take to encourage further fan fiction production. They can reduce barriers to fan fiction production by revoking their copyright protections over specifically fan fiction. So they can say, we don't like copyright violation in general, but if it's done for fan fiction purposes, that's okay. And I'm going to argue that doing that will lead fans to consume and produce more fan fiction overall. So to get to that first point, does fan fiction have these substitution and dilution effects that we traditionally associate with copyright violation? To assess this, what I had to do was test this experimentally. I wanted to compare consumers reading fan fiction, sort of the canonical activity of fan fiction consumers, to other sorts of strategies that brands employ to get consumers to consume more of their material. One thing that brands care a lot about is they want to re-expose fans to their original media products. This is the basis of how advertising works. If you re-expose consumers to something, they become more familiar with it, they tend to develop more positive associations with it. And so the theory is that if a brand can get a consumer to re-engage with their original media product, their willingness to pay for future brand content should go up. So what I wanted to do was compare consumers reading fan fiction to re-engagement with original media materials. And I did this experimentally using a sample of 600 undergraduate students, where I had them either read fan fiction or reread an original book that they'd already read. And then I measured how willing they were to pay for future brand content on the basis of that experience. And so to make this a bit more concrete, I had 600 consumers come into the lab, and they were split into one of 2 groups. So we had 2 groups of 300 consumers each. And in these groups, consumers read either Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, book 1. So they read that for as long as they could for 20 minutes, or they read a very popular fan fiction on fanfiction.net called Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality. So each group of 300 read these books for at least 20 minutes, and we had them read them through fully and then rate their enjoyment of the reading material, as well as how likely they were to purchase future products from the Harry Potter universe. And to give you a sense of the results that we came to, what we found is that for fans who really enjoyed this reading material, so for people who really liked the Harry Potter series, who liked the fan fiction, who liked that entire reading experience, for people who were in that fan fiction condition, those 300 consumers, they were actually more likely to be willing to express future purchase intent from Bloomsbury Publishing with respect to the Harry Potter franchise. And so this is a really important comparison. We show experimentally and causally, I think, that reading fan fiction might outperform other strategies that brands already employ to get consumers to engage and read more with their material. And so this sort of takes away from brands' concerns that fan fiction might have these substitution effects. It doesn't seem to be the case that exposure to fan fiction and reading fan fiction makes fans less willing to purchase future brand content. If anything, they might be more willing to purchase future brand content. And we do some similar tests I'm not going to show for the sake of time, where we also test dilution. We look at measures like fans' brand attachments, or how they view the Harry Potter series, or how they view the publishing house as well. And we find that fan fiction outperforms the original media content as well. The other thing I want to note is that in addition to this experiment, we've also engaged in several replications and extensions of the study where we test these effects with respect to fans writing fan fiction instead of just reading fan fiction. And there we also show that writing fan fiction versus simply recalling experiences of a particular brand increases consumption intent. And we've also extended this beyond just the topic of fan fiction to also look at the phenomenon of fan games. So is it the case that playing fan-made Pokemon games increases consumption intent over and above replaying the same Pokemon games again? And there we find similar results as to this study. So having demonstrated that there is this potential positive benefit of fan fiction and that it lacks some of the substitution and dilution effects that we traditionally associate with copyright violation, the next study we wanted to engage in was, well, what are some of the other benefits that fan fiction might have for brands? And one thing that I thought could be interesting would be to look at how fan fiction might serve as a useful predictor of brand performance. So we know that fan fiction consumers, the people who are on fan fiction websites, are really, really engaged fans with their brands. And brands have this particular problem when they're trying to gauge fan sentiment, particularly on social media platforms. There's a big compositional problem. If a brand goes out and they're trying to assess how do fans think about us, and they're looking to sites like Twitter, Reddit, or YouTube, a problem that comes up is that these brands aren't actually sure if people who are engaged in discussions about a brand are actually fans of that brand or simply people who are commenting on that brand sort of out of hand. So imagine you're the Supernatural brand, or you're the studio that produces Supernatural, and you're trying to assess fan sentiment on Twitter. You go and you look at hashtag Supernatural and you try and see how fans are talking about your brand. If someone says, I don't like Supernatural, you have no clue if that person was a really strong fan of Supernatural to begin with. It could just be some random person who tried it out and didn't like it. So brands are worried about this because they want to improve their predictive capabilities. And one thing that I think fan fiction platforms have uniquely is that it's a way for fans to self-filter into being very strong fans of a particular media property. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to look at how the aggregated output of different fan fiction platforms could help better predict the performance of serialized television shows. Specifically, I focused on the phenomenon of Supernatural, Supernatural being a weekly a serialized television show where episodes are published every single week, and we have some data on the viewership that Supernatural experiences. So these are the viewership numbers for every single Supernatural episode over the course of its run. And importantly, Supernatural has some pretty wide swings in how many people are viewing those episodes. You can sort of eyeball and see that there's some changes between seasons for Supernatural, but overall, we know that there's lots of different viewership numbers every single week for the show Supernatural. And if you're the Supernatural brand, you really want to be able to predict those numbers very well because you want to be able to sell ads. And to sell ads, you need to have a very strong sense of how many people are going to tune into your episode next week. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to look and see if the aggregated output of fanfiction communities, how much content people are writing every single week, might help brands in predicting the performance of their future serialized television shows. So we gathered this really cool data set. We gathered a large data set of every fanfiction with IDs between 1 and 10 million that was published on fanfiction.net. So we have millions and millions of text files of all these different fanfictions that have been published. We have a large data set of every IMDb rating, so a quality rating per episode of Supernatural, as well as a large data set of all the viewership numbers of every Supernatural episode. And we combine them all so that we can get a sense of, for each Supernatural episode, what did the history before that episode was published look like for this brand? So for a given Supernatural episode, if we look to the last week, how many views did last week's episode get? What were the ratings of the last week's episode? Was it a good episode, a bad episode? And then also, how many fan fictions were produced? And what we expected to find is that as fan fiction was published on these different platforms, we had a count variable for how many fan fictions were published in a week leading up to a Supernatural episode. And what we expected to find is that when fan fiction production was very high and ratings were very high, that was indicative of fans, the most dedicated fans of a particular brand, being very excited for the next week's episode. And that's when we should expect to see the most strongest viewership numbers for the next week of Supernatural. And that's exactly what we find in a multi-level regression model. I'm going to skip over some of the specific numbers and I'll just show you this visually. What we find is that fan fiction and fan fiction community output in aggregate can serve as an interesting qualification to existing performance metrics. We know that you can predict the performance of next week television episodes by looking at how many viewers an episode got in the last week, as well as how good last week's episode was. But if you moderate that by the aggregated output of fan fiction communities, what you find is that if fans are really, really excited about a brand, they're going to be publishing a lot of fan fiction related to it. And so if that's the case, then the effects of last week's viewership and last week's ratings get substantially stronger. So in summary, what we found is that using the aggregated output of fan fiction communities can also benefit brands by helping them better predict the performance of their serialized television shows. So just to sum up this first part of the paper, what we've demonstrated here is that fan fiction lacks some of the substitution and dilution effects that we traditionally associate with copyright violation, and fan fiction may even benefit brands by helping them better predict the performance of their media properties. And then the final question I want to get to, which will bring us a little bit back more into Harry Potter world as well, is what can brands actually do to encourage fan fiction production? And so here, what I wanted to do was look at, well, are there particular strategies that brands could employ to reduce the barriers that some fan fiction authors might have to producing more fan fiction? And here, what I wanted to look at was a really interesting announcement made by J.K. Rowling in 2004. In 2004, J.K. Rowling made this public commitment that she wouldn't be pursuing copyright violation claims against fan fiction authors. She did this midway through 2004, and importantly, no other authors that I'm aware of made similar announcements at that same time. And because I have access to the data of all fanfiction.net fanfictions that were published between 1998 and 2015, I can actually observe the impact of J.K. Rowling's statement on the aggregated output of the Harry Potter fanfiction community. And that's really interesting because by reducing a barrier to fanfiction production, what we can observe empirically is that fanfiction authors ended up writing substantially more Harry Potter fanfiction over the coming weeks after J.K. Rowling's announcement. So again, just to give a bit of context, J.K. Rowling makes this announcement in 2004, and at the time, just doing some basic text analysis, about 45% of all fan fictions in this dataset related to Harry Potter included some sort of copyright disclaimer. So certainly J.K. Rowling made this announcement at a time when copyright violation was very salient for authors. So to give a sense of the data, the Harry Potter fandom in the first few months of 2004 was the largest fandom on fanfiction.net. This shows the quantity of fanfictions posted in those first few months, Harry Potter being the biggest, but you can see some others that you might recognize. Fandoms like Lord of the Rings, Inuyasha, and Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pirates of the Caribbean. And what we wanted to do to assess the effect of J.K. Rowling's announcement on Harry Potter fanfiction production was leverage something called a synthetic control model. A synthetic control model, in essence, tries to simulate the performance of a particular thing by using other things that are very similar to it and constructing an artificial or synthetic version of it that you can then compare after an intervention happens. So if that sounds very abstract, I'm just going to give you a sense of this graphically. So here what I'm showing you on this graph is the production rate of new fan fictions published every single week for the Harry Potter fandom and the synthetic Harry Potter fandom. So that solid black line, that's the real quantity of Harry Potter fan fictions published every single week. And that dash blue line is a synthetic version of the Harry Potter fandom using a weighted combination of other large fandoms in the fanfiction.net space that are constructed such that they accurately simulate the ups and downs of the Harry Potter fanfiction production rate. And you can see that these two lines, they seem to be moving in parallel pretty well. But what happens after J.K. Rowling makes her announcement? Well, after J.K. Rowling makes her announcement, these lines diverge substantially. And what this means is that if these synthetic Harry Potter fandoms were constructed such that they accurately match the real Harry Potter fandom, then when we see a gap widen up between them after a particular event, we can make a causal claim that that particular event caused that relative increase in the actual real version of that thing. And so what we can see is that after J.K. Rowling's announcement, the overall increase in new fan fictions published per week went up by about 500 new fan fictions. And putting that into terms of word count, about 4 million new words per week were published in the J.K. Rowling, or rather Harry Potter fandom over time. And so across the rest of the empirical package, we also look at some other strategies that brands might employ to encourage further fanfiction production, things like early encouragement of new authors as they are getting started on these fanfiction platforms, as well as looking at some large-scale data sets that we've collected from many different qualitative surveys of fans, fan authors, and fanfic readers for why they engage with fanfiction platforms. And so overall, to wrap some of this up, what we show is that fan fiction, even though brands have this very contentious relationship with fan fiction might lack many of the downsides that we typically associate with copyright violation. And it can actually increase consumers' willingness to pay above and beyond the other things that brands already do. And in fact, fan fiction might also have some interesting and unique benefits that brands could leverage, things like predicting performance and capturing consumer sentiment. One thing that we're exploring right now is looking how fans relate to J.K. Rowling before and after she makes some transphobic statements in 2020, 2021. We can actually track in the Harry Potter fandom on AO3 all the different copyright disclaimers that fans make, and then get a sense of their sentiment that they make towards J.K. Rowling when they reference her. And so we're doing some work on that right now to see if we can show large discontinuities before and after J.K. Rowling makes those particular statements. And the thing that brands can do if fan fiction has these benefits for them is that they can revoke their copyright protections over specifically fan fiction and enjoy a much greater increase in the production rate of new fan fiction, as well as encourage new authors to get more fan fiction out there because brands benefit from having these very active and engaged fan communities. And I think we're right at time, so I will wrap up here. Thank you, everybody.